What is the gender dimension of physics and math?
A very difficult question.
Just the easy questions.
That's a very difficult question.
You're going to edit this, right?
Yes.
Well, my first reaction to that question, it's a really, really difficult question, actually, and it would take a very long answer to it, because one of the problems for me, as a non-physicist and non-mathematician, I'm afraid, is the term gender, actually.
Gender is multidimensional, or issues related to gender in physics and math in particular are multidimensional and very complex.
I think the most obvious answer to that question is thinking about the amount of women and men in the discipline. And that is certainly an important part of it. And in relation to that, obviously, related issues around kind of the broader infrastructure of science regarding who gets funding, what kind of positions are available to whom, etc., and looking at those things from a gender perspective. But I would also say that an equally important part are norms tied to the discipline, so norms around how you are supposed to be and behave and act within these disciplines, and in relation to that, and how individuals also position themselves in gendered ways, how they, in essence, do gender in relation to the structure, the gender structures of the discipline, and also the norms of the disciplines.
Well, I think we can think of the gender dimension much in the way that the European Commission thinks of it. So the gender dimension includes fixing the numbers, so bringing more women and underrepresented groups to math and to physics. The second is fixing the institutions, so making the culture of physics somewhere where everyone's careers can flourish. And the third, of course, the most I'm interested in, is fixing the knowledge, or looking at how you would integrate sex, gender, and intersectional analysis into the knowledge you're creating.
Gender and physics are related in many ways. Like, the people who are working in physics have gender, so it plays a role with the people working in physics and also their working culture, the workplace culture. But also I think it's because gender is a concept that we have in our society, and it's written in a lot of ideas and models we have. Also gender could be a part of the content of physics, like part of the models we describe the world, that also could be gendered. So I was working on the early concepts of electricity, and I was working on William Gilbert, and he's a doctor in medicine. He found out that electricity is a fluid. In his time, electricity was useless compared to magnetism, who was important to discover or discover the world, to find your way through the sea, the seven seas. So he used a concept that is very feminine. Fluidity was linked to femininity, not so highly valued as, for example, fire or air. And later on, when the physicists or the people had more ideas how to use electricity, suddenly they switched their concepts and used fire ideas to describe electricity. So you can see there is a kind of link between social inequalities and concepts you use for physical phenomena.
Gender never comes alone. It's never about gender alone. There are a lot of other factors or identities that intersect with gender, and that creates the complexity and, of course, the difficulty to address this issue. But I have to say that it's not an issue that it's evident in physics and mathematics alone. It's an issue of the underrepresentation of women or gender issues in general. We experience them every day in our societies as well. So they mirror this issue is mirrored in society as well.
It's very, very important not to reduce gender to say, fixed categories or binary categories, and not to what has been called actually in this conference, even today, so-called re-essentializing gender, which I think can easily happen, especially in policy debates, very easily, even when one's trying to do good by actually making science more gender equal.
There is institutional part of the answer of the question, which means that we check out what are the numbers of female scientists and male scientists in many different disciplines, and it varies a lot. And the second aspect would be how gender dimension is incorporated in the content of scientific research.
But for physics, I think we would include gender and intersectional analysis in the applied fields. So if physics is applied in medicine, you would have different visualizations. For example, the color of the skin could matter for how the technology would work. I gave an example earlier about the soap dispensers that don't dispense soap to people with darker skin, right? They work perfectly for people with lighter skin for whom they were developed, but the laser light doesn't see properly the darker skin since it wasn't developed for that, and therefore doesn't close the loop, and the soap is not dispensed. So I think we really have to think about the applications and for whom will these applications work.
So I'm interested in how gender intersects with multiple other identities, like racial identity, social class identity, ethnicity, single motherhood, cultural identities, linguistic identities, and how these intersections position someone either in a privileged position or in an oppressed position. So yeah, and that connects to what I said earlier, that it's never gender alone. Gender interacts with other identities all the time, and that's why it becomes difficult to kind of separate what happens when and which identity is causing perhaps oppression and what identity is causing a privilege and so on.
I would love to have knowledge which is done for everyone, which means it takes into account the differences which are among people. And it means that we have different ethnicities, different languages we speak, different background, social background, but also race, gender, and we are sometimes apart from binary divisions we are used to have in science and research. And what I count as a valuable knowledge is not only knowledge which is aiming at truth and saying something about the world, but also knowledge which takes into account that it should be doing some justice. It should be good.
And then I think there's a slightly sort of wider issue, which you could say is around the whole of science, actually. I mean, as an institution or universities. And I think here, there's this great danger of thinking about science and universities as somehow gender neutral, and then you add women, or you try and encourage more women or more girls to come in, which I think is actually the wrong way of thinking about it, because in a sense institutions, both historically and now, including universities and so on, are masculinized through and through, actually, in terms of their history, their structure, their hierarchy, their traditions, including in Lund. So that's a slightly bigger question than thinking only about the everyday practice. And is also very important for how power works and who actually has power in those institutions, both universities and, if you like, in science, how it operates through networks, through journals and funding and so on and so forth. And then there's this, you could say, more difficult area, which is usually called knowledge making, and how, if you like, men and masculinities I mean, how can one avoid looking at the question of men and masculinities if you're interested in knowledge and knowledge making? Again, historically, it's most easy to see that. But I mean, it still applies in a sense, whose ideas get most time and attention, right? Who are the opinion leaders? To talk about men and masculinities in physics or in science is not sort of taking that as a separate object. It's thinking all the time about the relations that exist between men and women and further genders and masculinities and femininities of many different kinds.
So we think that technology is very much linked to masculinity, and this is it's not outspoken. So it's very hard to work against these stereotypes or concepts. So they're so hidden, but I think they're still effectively working. And like also the history of technology, history of physics, it's so male dominated. So you don't see the women who have been there, and you don't have role models to be inspired as a black person, a female person, to go into physics. So, and also maybe some of my experience, some of the professors, white old men, they think they are the standard type, and the next generation should be most similar to themselves. So this is also something, and they don't reflect about these concepts they have.
Well, I think on the one hand, it's about changing power relations, because a lot of the ways of, what you could say, doing masculinities, not all, but a lot of the ways of doing masculinities, particularly sort of conventional ways, I don't like the word traditional, but conventional or normative ways need to be changed, basically, and that also applies to other privileged groups or categories, like white people or whiteness.
In physics, it's just a little more hidden, maybe. So I guess my first advice would be to actually acknowledge physics also, not just as the scientific discipline, but also as a human endeavor. And to look at those things regarding how physics is gendered when it comes to norms, when it comes to expectations, when it comes to how different peoples are recognized or not within this discipline. So simply acknowledging physics as a human enterprise, I think that's a really good starting point.
But I think, the complexity comes from the fact that it's a systemic issue. I think it's multi-level, it's multi-contextual. It requires input from very different disciplines in order to address it. Biology, social sciences, the humanities, the sciences as well.
The point is that any kind of scientific work, natural sciences, gain so much by including the social sciences, and the social sciences gain so much by using statistical methods or some of the methods from the natural sciences. So we have a lot to gain from each other, and we will produce products, we will produce ideas, we will produce knowledge that works better for everyone if we think of it in a human way.
And I think this is a little opportunity to bring in the question that it's perhaps not something like quantitative scientific excellence that counts. Londa mentioned, I think this is important, but transdisciplinarity, true transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, I would say true transdisciplinarity, meaning that you change methodologies, that you change concepts. It's not only an adding of the social category.
At a more practical level, as I said earlier, this is a systemic issue, and hence I think it requires a systemic approach, meaning synergy of different actors. So I think an individual will not be able to address it, but a team of people who work at different positions, at the policy level, research level, more practical level, if these people come together, that provides a more systemic approach to it. But also, as I said earlier, collaborations across disciplines, because we have evidence from different disciplines that contribute towards better understanding this issue of underrepresentation of not only women, but also gender diverse people, non-binary, transgender individuals as well. And hence an interdisciplinary and systemic approach is necessary in my view.
It is important to have measures, quantitative measures. It's important to have the studies. And it's important to have what I call top-down strategies, so governance of science. But I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks that these strategies will not solve the problem of gender or intersected equity sustainable or durable. And this is what I meant. This is not a stable target. When we once reach it, it's fixed. Yeah. We have a time of anti-genderism, of anti-feminism, of re-essentialization of difference, of biological difference, which is very strong these days. So this leads us to the point that we also have to again and again argue otherwise, or what I would say, get literacy into the field of actors and institutions. And I'm not saying that we don't need governance, that we don't need EU levels, that we don't need numbers. But what we need is really raising awareness of what is interacting. This is a longer process, I think. And it does not fit so well, that is quite right in capitalist, neoliberal, a discourse of excellence and innovation.
I love science. As a philosopher of science, I really admire that stuff. But recently, in the climate of catastrophic environmental change and collapse of the way we live so far, I would say we all should slow down.
I think we will not get it sustainable better if we match into the current innovation, growth, discourse. So that's my position.
I'm not saying that the ultimate goal should be to recruit equal amounts of women and men, but rather to have people, to make the people in the discipline feel like they belong, and to have a wide diversity of people feel welcomed and feel belonging within the disciplines, thereby also hopefully contributing to a more diverse kind of set of knowledge practices within the discipline.
There is no simple solution to this, otherwise we would have solved it several years ago.
Yeah.
I actually think one of the most important things, and I hope this doesn't come over as sounding heroic, actually, because it's not meant to. I think the most important thing, actually, is to be totally committed, actually. And I mean, it's good for anybody to get involved, as long as they're reasonably progressive, Although you can actually do damage by sometimes by as I said, re-essentializing gender, for instance, if you don't think about that beforehand. But I think this is a very, very long-term process, like historically, very long-term.
What I like about science and about scientific research, that in a sense we are not sure about our results. That's the methodology, that we are skeptical about it, that we think about it, that we say that if you will give me counter-argument, I have to take it into account seriously, and so on and so forth. That's the main difference. People on daily basis, they're quite sure about the statements and everything, and scientists should be always very careful. And that's why we have scientific community, which is checking out every time that you can be wrong. And that's emotionally quite difficult, but I think this being anxious and cautious is beneficial for all of us in the end. They were really interesting and provoking.
Well, I think we have enough.
Enough? I don't know. Have you?